Welcome. This is a short video to talk about a few things related to the stomach. One is the functions of the stomach, then we talk about pepsinogen and intrinsic factor. So the functions of the stomach is to note that the stomach serves as a reservoir of food or a temporary place for the storage of food, and is important in releasing food into the small intestine in a controlled fashion, meaning it's not all released at one time, but in a methodical manner. Okay, so secretion of intrinsic factor, which serves as a transporter of vitamin B12, important carrier. Without intrinsic factor or without vitamin B12, one could suffer from a type of anemia called pernicious anemia. Okay, vitamin B12 stimulates erythropoiesis, and that's where if vitamin B12 is lacking, or the intrinsic factor, which is important in the binding of vitamin 12, is lacking, a type of anemia called pernicious anemia could be the result. All right. Now, the stomach allows the beginning of protein digestion. There is no further digestion of carbohydrate, which started in the mouth, and gastric lipase that's present in the stomach is not really fully utilized, because the nature of the lipids in the diet is such that most of it is very large in size, and it has to be emulsified first, which is yet to happen in the small intestine. Okay, so chemical digestion of proteins occurs with the help of an enzyme made within the stomach, pepsinogen, that is going to be activated to pepsin by the presence of hydrochloric acid. Okay, hydrochloric acid being present in greater amounts in the gastric juice activates pepsinogen to pepsin. Okay, and that's what begins the digestion of proteins and polypeptides. Gastric juice also helps liquefy food. Let's say you had solid food that is in the form of bolus. When it arrives here in the stomach, there is this churning action. Churning is mixing of food with gastric juice, and that is how the food now gets a new consistency that is like a semi-thick soup texture, and that's what you refer to as chyme. All right, as I mentioned, it is a controlled release. It's a slow release of a small amount of food at any one time into the small intestine until all of the food is processed. Okay, good. With this, let's focus on the enzyme pepsinogen. Ogen, with the enzyme name, tells you that it's an inactive enzyme. Pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme. Okay, the cell that makes pepsinogen is Chief cells, and it is released into the lumen, and so it's part of gastric juice. Now, you note that if the enzyme is released in its active form, it has the ability to digest any protein that it comes in contact with, and that's where the cell could be, the cell where it's made could be destroyed, and any other structures within the stomach could be destroyed if it was released in its active form. All right, so now pepsinogen that's released is acted upon by hydrochloric acid, okay, and that's when it becomes pepsin, an active form of pepsinogen. All right, it's a protein digesting enzyme. When you say protein digesting enzyme, it could be protein, polypeptide, or a peptide. All right, any of these amino acid chains that are in contact with pepsin could be digested further. So if it is a polypeptide, you probably would see a peptide fragments. If it's a protein, when it's digested, you may see them as polypeptide fragments, etc. Okay, good. The action of pepsin is in acidic environment. Okay, so optimal pH for its action is 1.8 to 3.5. And that condition is created only in the stomach within the digestive tract. That's because of the high amount of acid that is present in gastric juice. All right, so this enzyme is going to be only active in the stomach, only at a certain pH, acidic pH, okay? And it can be inactivated over a pH of 5, that is in a reversible manner. So although it's inactivated, it could be activated again when the pH drops to 1.8 to 3.5. So irreversibly inactivated at pH of 7 to 8. So think about small intestine where the pH is alkaline, all right, where pepsin will be inactivated. And think about the stomach when you bring in more food that may not necessarily be acidic, the pH may temporarily jump to a higher pH than 3.5. That's when it may temporarily be inactivated, but over time, the acid release would bring the pH down, and therefore pepsin can still be active. Okay, good. So that's a little bit about pepsin and pepsinogen. You will learn about the action of pepsin in the discussion of how carbohydrate, proteins, and lipids are digested and absorbed, that we discuss at a later time. Now, let's move on to learn about another protein, that is intrinsic factor. Okay, intrinsic factor is actually made within the stomach. Okay, parietal cells are the ones that secrete intrinsic factor. Okay, so think about it like this: vitamin B12 that's in your diet is bound to a protein. It's not intrinsic factor, it's bound to a carrier protein, a binding protein that is in the gastric juice. However, once it reaches the small intestine, the first part of the small intestine is duodenum. That's where you have these proteases that are made in the pancreas brought to the small intestine. They break off this binding protein and release vitamin B12 and then couple it with intrinsic factor. Okay, so long story short, what you want to know is intrinsic factor made within the stomach ultimately binds to vitamin B12 and becomes a complex that you call as intrinsic factor vitamin B12 complex. This is absorbed into blood by within the ileum. Okay, so that is how you bring in vitamin B12 into the system with the help of intrinsic factor. All right, as I mentioned before, lack of vitamin B12 could lead to pernicious anemia. So if there is ileic disease, that's where you're talking about absorption of vitamin B12 is affected. Resection of the stomach is where the secretion of intrinsic factor is affected, and atrophic gastritis, inflammation of the lining of the stomach where there is atrophy of the epithelial lining, could also lead to lack of intrinsic factor, and therefore a type of anemia that you refer to as pernicious anemia. All right, this is where we stop. Thank you.